Welcome, everyone. I'm Penny Lewis, Executive Director of the Ecological Landscape Alliance, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar, Artful Rainwater Design, as part of our Focus on Sustainability webinar series. This series was developed by a group of organizations known regionally for their quality ecological education. In case you're not familiar with our organizations, they're all nonprofit and largely volunteer groups in the United States. The Ecological Landscape Alliance, the Chesapeake Conservation Landscaping Council, the Midwest Ecological Landscape Alliance, and Eco Landscape California. And now I'd like to introduce our presenter. Dr. Stuart Echols is an Associate Professor of Landscape Architecture at Penn State University. His interests focus on integrating two aspects of stormwater design, utility and amenity. Through his research, Dr. Echols has developed a method of stormwater design that integrates the landscape and stormwater in a way that seeks to restore and preserve natural hydrology. Together with Professor Eliza Pennypacker, Dr. Echols co-authored the book Artful Rainwater Design, Creative Ways to Manage Stormwater. Welcome, Stuart.
Welcome. Thank you for having me here, Penny. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm assuming that everyone can hear me, and if they cannot, please send a note to Penny, and she'll have to make adjustments. Today, I'm going to be speaking to you about one of my favorite subjects, Artful Rainwater Design. That is, if I can get the slide to advance. And my slide is not advancing. There we go. Okay. So my co-author is not here, Eliza Pennypacker. She has had numerous things that she's had to take care of as department head, but this is research that we both did together. And what I'm going to do is go over basically the subjects that are up on the outline right now. I doubt that we'll get to everything. I tend to bring way more information to these webinars than we have time for. My students hate it because my classes run long, but this webinar will not. It'll be good to know. So to start with, we want to talk a little bit about background, which is really pretty simple. The normal way that we have managed stormwater over the years, we started out looking at flood control, flood management. And then in the 50s or so, we started looking at point source pollution. I remember in the 70s, yes, I'm that old, everything was about erosion and sediment control. We then started looking at stream channel protection because we discovered that our detention basins were basically blowing out our streams. And then, of course, more recently, non-point source programs have become very important to what we do. So I'm showing you a slide in just a moment, as it transitions, of a stormwater management system. This one is in Edinburgh, one of my favorite sites, because this system, although it does manage stormwater, it also does other things. It provides a recreational amenity to the university, which is loved by everybody there. Contrast this with the common sort of system that we see where we live. This slide is actually, used to be a creek here. When I was young, then I played in. The creek in the forest is long gone. This is the detention basin adjacent to a shopping center, obviously. This is ugly, doesn't do anything for wildlife, yet it's the sort of thing that we see all the time. And in the next slide, this is two of my favorite photographs because these are two designs done by the same person, Rob Traver, down at Villanova University. But the designs were done 20 years apart. The one on the left is the old design. The one on the right is the new design. Now, this is normally where I would ask for audience participation, but I cannot hear you, so you have to just put up with me faking it. What I would ask the audience is, what does the one on the right provide that the one on the left does not? And one of the first things they always say is, it provides wildlife habitat, which it does. It also provides for water quality. It does better cleaning. One of the things I always think is fun is that it hides the trash, which I'm not sure that's always a good thing. I think sometimes we want to expose the trash and the dirt that's in our stormwater. It also provides for greater beauty and aesthetics. You'll notice that there is an office complex behind it, and many times folks from that office complex will come out and eat eat their lunch adjacent to this facility. So in that sense, it actually adds good property value. And then the one that I always love is it discourages geese. Geese are something that are always getting into our stormwater systems and polluting them like crazy, as many of you probably know. And this has all come about due to changes in our attitudes, our goals, and our regulations. So as these have changed over the years, we add one. We're not sure what to call it. We can call it sustainable, low-impact development, or integrated. We'll probably figure out what we're really going to call it in a few years. I think these days we're calling it green infrastructure. This is a direct result of changing regulations, changes to the Clean Water Act, National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, and in a lot of cities because of combined sewer overflows. So we're starting to see a change in how stormwater is managed because it's starting to be managed for the first flush and for water quality. My difficulty is that a lot of these designs that we see every day, they're built on the least valuable land. They're constructed for the lowest cost. They're designed just to manage the runoff. They're not intended for people, and quite frankly, they're ugly. And here are 4 examples that I often use because these 4 examples hydrologically are doing the right thing. In fact, they are doing a fabulous job. And if you look at the one in the upper left corner, it actually is dirty inside, which it shouldn't be because it's got lots of road film and scum and trash in there. So it's doing the exact job it should be. The one in the lower right is also cleaning water. In fact, it is a giant infiltration filtration system. I've actually tasted the water that comes out of this. It's bitter because it's rainwater, but it is incredibly clean. But my difficulty is that all these are really doing is managing water. And there are a lot of other things that we could be gaining from doing good design. And so there's a fellow, Dr. Starr, who's passed away a few years ago, unfortunately, who was looking at the ideas of what are some of the positive values that we can gain from well-designed stormwater systems. And these are a collection of the ones that he thinks are the most important. And the reason I bring this up is because there's been a change around the country in how we manage stormwater. Now, when I went to school, we were just looking at water quantity, how fast and how much, and could we avoid damaging things and getting sued, frankly. And then I went back to school, because I just keep going back to school. We started looking at water quality. You know, what was it in terms of total suspended solids, in terms of nitrogen, in terms of oils, trash, etc. And I believe that one of the things that I enjoy most now is looking at the idea of amenity. And I believe that this amenity idea is going to be one of the great design opportunities. In fact, I believe it already is for landscape architects and all designers, frankly, that we can start to create stormwater management systems that frankly delight people. And so, what is this idea of amenity? If you look at some of the new designs that are going in, they're really quite stunning. They grab your attention. They're beautiful. And these are just 8 examples from around the country. We'll come back and talk about a few of them in a minute. And so we're seeing a move. The move from the old idea of rainwater disposal, just get it out of here and manage it the best you can, to a new idea of rainwater as an amenity. How can we design these things that add all sorts of different values for the community, for the developer, for the people that are going by? So Eliza and I, a few years ago, started on a study to figure out, if there are designers around the country that are starting to do this sort of work, what is it about their design that we can use to inspire and guide other people in the same area? So we undertook a case study, and frankly, this has been ongoing. We thought we were going to finish it one day. The good news is that there are always more fantastic examples that are coming up. And so the case study looks at a range of project types and also a range of stormwater management types. And these are the ones we started with. These are the original projects in the first case study. You'll notice there's a geographical bias here. Most of these are in the Northwest. Now, that's not true anymore, but when we started, this is where some of the really interesting work was being done, and so this is where we started with the case studies. From these case studies, we had particular goals, things we wanted to figure out. We wanted to figure out if there is a way to create amenity with the same assurance that we create utility. What I mean by that is if you look down the left-hand column, these are the sort of goals and objectives and techniques that you find in so many stormwater management manuals, and they get copied all around the country. And you're probably familiar with many of these goals and these actual techniques. But one of the things we did discover is when it came to amenity, that there wasn't anything really written about it, about how can you actually design a system to create amenity. And to start with, when we did the study, we had to figure out, well, what the heck do we mean by amenity? And the nice thing, it was our study, so we looked around, but eventually came to our own conclusion that amenity is the intent to provide an experience of the rainwater in ways that increase the landscape's attractiveness or value. Now, as we were going through this study, we looked at many, many case studies, and of those case studies, we tried to see, well, what are the things that are adding amenity? Of that, we came up with a few categories. Some we threw out and some we brought back in, but they're pretty straightforward. First one was education. Second one was recreation. Third one is safety, which you might not think as an amenity at first, but I'll explain why in a minute. Public relations, which is really a fun one to be truthful. And no great surprise, aesthetic richness is one of the things we found to be a goal. So we developed a website, we did a lot of talks. Eventually people asked us, when are you going to write the book? So we did write the book, and here's a copy of the cover, and we're not going to talk much about the book. You can find it online. We're just going to use it as a placeholder to tell you that the first amenity we're going to talk about is education. Education. How do you create conditions to learn about stormwater issues? Basically, how do you teach other people? We found that there were a lot of objectives and design techniques. So in objectives, there were ideas to learn, there were ways to learn, and there were contexts for learning. And today I'm only going to talk about two of them with you. Under the ideas to learn, we're going to talk about water treatment types, and we're going to talk about, under ways to learn, talk about signage. So these are the two, and we're going to use one project to talk about them. So in ideas to learn, we're going to start by looking at Pierce County Environmental Center. This one has been around for a while, and one of the things that we love about this one is it makes the stormwater treatment visible and legible. You can literally see it, but also follow it from one end to the other. As you go along, there is a pathway that follows it. There's actually a jogging trail that follows it. And at the end, there's actually a plaza that has a sign explaining that it's a flow splitter plaza at the end that spreads the water into 3 different treatment types. So they're making it visible and legible. They're making it playful. They're making kind of a puzzle that you can figure out. And they're also including a variety of different treatment systems, from gravel line swales to wetlands to infiltration systems. So just having a variety and having them visible is one of the main takeaways we want you to understand. Second one, ways to learn. Signage. Signage. How boring could that possibly be? We've all seen large signs that had paragraphs of information on them. In fact, I've been known to take photographs of them thinking I'll come back and read them later. We never do. I still have photographs on the computer. But there's some times where people do signage in a way that gets your attention. And again, we're back at Pierce County Environmental Center. And one of the things that they did is they provided clear, simple signs that have very brief text and just a little bit of graphics. The other thing they did is they used color. So you can see these signs are bright yellow. And if you look at the lower left-hand image, they place the signs so that as you finish reading one, you can see another sign just down the path. And it's purposely done that way So as you go along the path, you only stop for a moment at each sign. But by the time you've gone along the entire path, you've gotten just as much information as you would have had from a big 4x8 sign that was laser printed and laminated. But you've gotten it in little bits, and we find that people actually stop and read these things. So 2 simple techniques. First off, keep them short, simple, with a little bit of graphics, and do things with the signage that gathers people's attention. Next one is recreation. Recreation seems like an odd thing when you think about stormwater management, but we're talking about creating conditions for people to interact with the stormwater system in ways that are relaxing, amusing, and or even refreshing, if you will. We found that there were basically 3 categories, ways that people could be set up to view the system, way they could enter the system, and believe it or not, ways they could actually play in the system. So of these, I'm only going to speak about 2 today, pause and access. So under the idea of viewing things, you can allow people to pause and visually see something and maybe learn about it. So we're going to talk about that one first. And the example I'm going to give you is the Convention Center in Oregon. This is a ginormous center, and it drains 5 acres of water down the side of the wall. And one of the things they've taken advantage of is the fact that when people go to conventions, at least when I go, you're stuck inside in the air conditioning in these dark rooms. You're listening to slide talks. You're trying to be kind and stay awake. And when you actually get a chance to step outside, you take it. Now, it used to be you stepped outside to take a smoke, but now you just step outside to get out. And so when you step outside at the convention center, you wind up on an overlook. And this overlook, you can see the folks standing out there. What they're looking down at is the photograph in the lower right of the actual stormwater management system. And the designers took advantage of it. So if you go to the photograph where we're shooting through the doors, you can see there's signage there. And that signage explains to everybody exactly what this system is, why it's important, how it's working, and where you'd want to go for more information. So just the ability to pause and look at a system. We've actually seen coffee shops designed around stormwater management systems as well, where people simply sit out, have a coffee, and be undercover, but be able to watch the rain flow through the space. The second one you might think is odd, entry, being able to actually have access to something. And for this one, we're going to go back to the exact same design. Make entry points that are easily accessible. So if you look at the top left slide, there's a corten steel divider, and there's a pedestrian walkway out by the street, but the grass is also cut so that it's a nice place to walk. And as you're walking along, you come to the tall photograph on the right. And the designer swears it wasn't intended this way, but they swear with a wink and a nod. You're invited to step in. And here we have a photograph of a child actually in the system playing. Now, we understand that there are huge liabilities with this sort of thing, but to go into the system when it's dry is fascinating. And it's actually designed so it is accessible, that you can walk in there and explore. So the idea of making entry points that are easily accessible and actually making places that people can sit down and look at and enjoy the system. Most often when it's dry, but I would imagine people could even get in there when it's wet. In the case here with the photograph on the right where you've got that scupper, it might not be advised. By the way, that scupper is way in the background. It's about 10 feet tall. So it's not actually dumping on Eliza sitting there if it rains. But the idea is still the same, that you can design systems so that people can enter and play in them if you wish. Safety. Doesn't seem like an amenity at first. It seems like a necessity. And when we're talking about safety, we're really talking about the intent, the way that we can promote interaction that mitigates the danger associated with water. Whether there actually is danger or whether it's just a perception or not is a whole other issue. Under safety, we found there are basically 2 ways of going about it. One, you can control access, the exact opposite of what we were just doing with recreation. And you control the quantity of the water, which is basically the depth of the velocity. Of these, we're going to talk just about access for a second. So we're going to talk about vertical barriers, we're going to talk about horizontal barriers, we're going to talk about vertical barriers first. This seems a pretty simple idea. In the upper right photograph, you have vegetation that is so thick that it's actually difficult to walk into the system. We've actually seen systems that have been designed with vegetation that purposely is chosen because it has thorns to keep people from climbing into the system, or to specifically design it so there are only places they can get in where it's safe. And then in the lower photograph, something as simple as a railing to keep folks from falling over into things. These things are pretty simple and pretty obvious. The railing, everyone does. The vegetation, people are starting to do better. The one that we think is kind of fun, though, is when you start to look at horizontal barriers. And that is, how do you put people above the water? I guess we could put them below the water, but I haven't seen any examples of that yet. It probably wouldn't be hard, to be truthful. But the idea of using bridges and boardwalks and platforms so that folks can be above the water and actually see it flowing through. Fairly straightforward, simple solution, and absolutely safe. One of the things we find really pleasant about these is that they are designed purposely so that the water makes some noise while folks are walking past it. Public relations, one of our favorites, to be truthful. So the idea of public relations is that you're, creating some statements about the value of those who create the system and or own the site. Seems a little haughty at first, but we found that there were not that many objectives, but they were fairly clear: that we care, that we are progressive, or that we are smart, or finally that we are sophisticated. Of this, we're just going to start with the simple one, the idea that we care. With we care, we want people to understand that we are environmentally responsible, and we want you to learn about stormwater. One of the best examples that we can think of is in High Point, Seattle. This project is about many, many things, but one of the primary organization systems with it is about stormwater. They actually have designed this so there is no runoff from even a 100-year storm. It doesn't all soak into the ground, but it is a location that has a good amount of infiltration. And so they start, as far back as the downspouts to disconnect the downspouts, try to get the water into the ground as fast as they can. Then it runs towards the sidewalks, and it infiltrates in some of the sidewalks. It infiltrates, in a lot of fire retention areas. But they've taken a little step further in terms of PR. They have made it a selling point. And, it's fun because when you walk around the site, at least until about 2 years ago, there were all these chirpy little signs out there that told people what was going on and why it was important. And then they designed the systems to be extremely easy to identify and easy to access. One of the things that they discovered is that by association, people who bought into the community started to brag about the fact that they had this great stormwater treatment system in their community. So not only did it become a selling point for the developer, it actually wound up being a bit of a selling point for the folks that were living there, which became a lot of fun. And they took it a little further, even in their sidewalks and some of their downspout designs, to make sure that people understood, that this really is about stormwater. In the downspout, this is a representation of salmon going upstream so that people understand why this is being done. It's obviously to protect the salmon. And I love the fact that in the sidewalks, they just decided to incise the circles representing raindrops. And they actually went to the trouble to even bump the sidewalk out to make sure it happened. And the last one that I'm going to talk about today is simply aesthetic richness. Now, aesthetic richness is simply creating an experience of beauty or pleasure focused on the stormwater. And that's the key. It's focused on the stormwater. Needless to say, we found lots of categories here that we could talk about. In fact, we could actually spend an hour talking about just this category, but just going to pick two today. We're going to talk both under visual interest about line and color and texture, starting with line. And in this case, we're going to go to a project also in Washington State. This is the Cedar River Environmental Center. And one of the things they've done here, this is their main courtyard for their educational center, and they have designed their downspouts and their runnels to run straight across the courtyard in this beautiful, sensuous curve. And there's no way when you're walking through this courtyard, whether it's raining or not raining, that you can miss this. It's incredibly obvious. And so it draws attention with just this beautiful line in the landscape. It also becomes part of something we call the Stormwater Trail. The fact is that you can start at one end and visually follow the water to where it's going. And so when you get over to the edge where there's a railing, you can see there's a waterfall that goes down into a bioretention system. And if you want, you can climb down and see where it goes from there, because it keeps going in a bit of a trail before it gets to the lake. But the idea is that it enhances the legibility, but also the interest and the curiosity for folks. So the idea that they can see the line and follow the trail along. The other one we found very common was color and texture. There's such an opportunity when you're dealing with water to do a juxtaposition of natural and man-made elements. One of the things that I've always been fascinated by is when I see stormwater systems created with crushed stone instead of with river stone of some sort, because just the choice of the river stone tells people this could be about water, and then the choice of the plants and how that composition contrasts with the juxtaposition to the stones. So there's so many opportunities to do really fun things, in our opinion, with the aesthetic richness. So those are the amenities that we wanted to talk about. And now I want to talk about another subject that's near and dear to our heart, and that's the aesthetic preference of the American public. Here you have a photograph of the Portland, Oregon Pollution Control Lab. This was the stunning photograph that they published in 2004 when it was built. When we got there 2 years later, it looked like this. Now, that entire trip, we had a debate about whether or not this was intended to go wild or whether this simply happened because no one knew how to maintain it. Unfortunately, the designer, Bob Morassi, has passed away, so we couldn't check with him. But one of the things that happened is that invasive willows came in, and it became so overgrown that you couldn't see the stormwater system at all about 5 years later. So there's this question with the American public of the contrast between the trim, the neat, and the wild and the woolly. So to bring that up, this is an example also in Portland, Buckman Heights. It's a courtyard design. In the middle of this courtyard are two bioretention systems, two rain gardens. And because of where it's located, they actually have a small privet hedge running around the whole thing, which is pretty well trimmed most every time I've been there. Not every time, but most of the time. And the idea of doing this is so that the planting that is inside that bioretention system, as it gets, messy, if you will, which I personally might think is beautiful, but the residents were concerned that it was unkept. And so by putting this hedge around it and trimming it, it sent a signal to people, a very obvious sign that this is intentional and no, it is not abandoned. And this goes back to the work of Joan Nassau from the mid-90s. And, a quote from Joan's article on Messy Ecosystems or the Frames. One of her quotes is, "What looks good may not be good, and what is good may not look good." The idea being that to some folks, a mowed lawn may look good, but environmentally it's not. Contrast with a meadow that looks overgrown, environmentally it's good, but aesthetically people have difficulty with it because they feel that it's not being taken care of. So Joan undertook a study where she did early photo renderings of a house with all sorts of different plantings. And, it was a question of, well, which would people prefer? And no big surprise. The number one preference was for the one that was totally mowed and neat. I, by the way, would love to do that study again and see if that's changed. But they were surprised that the runner-up and very close had some messy areas in it, but they were framed, and that we were actually finding there's a greater preference for this sort of thing. Now, this doesn't seem like difficult things to understand, and if you want to simplify it, use Joan's words, weeds are bad. Now, the definition of a weed, of course, is subject to where you are and what you understand about native species or not. But she went beyond that because it wasn't just about, what is a weed. It was the idea that weeds are only bad because to people they symbolize that things are abandoned and not taken care of. And that was the real issue that her research was talking about, is that people have in the American public a perception that if it's left to grow, it is just overgrown and no one cares about it. So that same idea goes back then to the Water Pollution Control Lab. Are these weeds here because they're natives? Are they here simply because it's abandoned and overgrown? And by the way, I can tell you some of these are natives, but a huge number of them are invasive that have grown in. So the key is that we try to show that things are cared for and that it's intent. And so there's a perception, again, of care and intent. Something as simple as taking a meadow and mowing the edge so that people know that it's intentional. Not only do you know that that pathway is intended for you to walk, but you know that the rest of that meadow has grown up and it is there and intentional. It's not simply left as if no one cares about it. She also talks about the idea of color, that if we can get color into our landscapes, especially year-round and somewhat structured, although not really, that shows the idea of intent. This one's one of my favorites, birdhouses and fences. I think it's great because I've been known to plant meadows and put fake birdhouses in when we plant, knowing that the birdhouses are not going to last. In fact, we normally go and take them back out after the meadow is established and looks better, and we discover that the birds never do move in. It's always wasp. But that's because the holes in our birdhouses were too small. But we're really not trying to put in bluebird houses in this case. We're simply trying to let people know that this is intentional. Now, we have done it with bluebird houses, very successful, but bluebirds don't tend to move in until the meadow grows up a bit. And then finally, the idea of a geometry that shows care, order, and intent. The fact is we have a very strong linear geometry here. We've got a mowed area, which is probably done with a weed or something. And then the planting is done in layers that become obvious to people that it's simply not let go. In fact, if you look further back in the slide, you can see there's a mowed path going up the hill. So all of these things show that it's intentional and that people are there and they care about it. And here's Joan's listing of all these things. Some of them you may agree with or not. I've yet to see lawn ornamentation that I like, but I can grow. It will happen. So why do we bring this up as such an important issue? So this is one of my favorite photographs. Three of my favorite people are in here. The fella with the camera is Tom Lipton. He's a fantastic designer in Oregon that is responsible for a lot of these projects. The woman in the background is my co-author, Eliza. And the fella with his shoe on the curb, I actually don't know his name, but we call him Joe. Now, we were out looking at this site, photographing things, and Joe, let's say Joe volunteered to give us a lecture in the landscape. Joe was not happy with this design. He was not happy with the fact that it was full of trash and that there's a bunch of gray stuff in the bottom of it. And he was very unhappy that some of the plants that were in there were now starting to grow in his yard. So I bring this up because what Joe thinks matters. Because if we expect green infrastructure or rain gardens or whatever you want to call it to be accepted in the public realm, we need to be able to design them in ways that the public does not find them upsetting. Joe was upset enough that they lost 3 parking spaces when this went in. But what he was really upset about was the fact that it wasn't being cared for, and it was, as Joe said, the ugliest thing I have seen on the street, and I've lived here for 20 years. What are the things that we can do about that? Well, we discovered as we go back and look at some of these projects that simplifying the designs, what are the things that work well and don't work well, we actually have found that over time, the ones that do good maintenance, they will choose the plants that thrive, and they will help those plants along, and they will remove the plants that don't thrive, and sometimes they'll even remove plants that are not aesthetically pleasing to the public. Now, I'm not saying that this is a good practice. I'm saying it's simply a reality that we need to be aware of what the public thinks of these, because the worst thing that we can do is put in these systems and have them taken out because the public thinks that they're ugly. They think that there are rats and snakes. I've actually had people complain about bees, which I found comical, but I try not to laugh in their face. I've never had anyone complain about butterflies, even though the butterflies are right next to the bees. The squirrels, they always complain about those, but that's a whole other story. But we need to recognize that these designs need to meet the public's expectations. Whether we agree with their aesthetic or not, we have to recognize that they are the folks that are going to determine whether or not these things continue to happen to people. So the next subject I want to talk about is one that's simply near and dear to me. And there are just some challenges for ARD. To begin with, stormwater systems, bioretention systems, are designed to handle small flows. If this is the sort of flow that's coming through your bioretention system has left. We need to design these for the small, the slow, and the dispersed systems. One of the things that we find really lacking in bioretention design is the idea of flow splitters. And a flow splitter is a very simple concept. Its intent is to do 2 things. Number one, it's to limit the amount of water that goes into the bioretention system so that the system is not blown away and washed downstream. The other thing it's designed to do is it's to collect the dirty water, the first flush, if you will, and allow the clean water that comes after the first flush to move on down. So in this example, you see water running down a curb, and there are slits in the curb. The size of those slits limit how fast the water can go in. So that will keep the system from being eroded away. But also notice there's no outlet at the bottom of the bioretention system. There's an outlet in the street, but not in the planting area. And so as water flows in, the system fills up, and it backs up, and it purposely backs up to the curb so that once it is full, the rest of the water goes down to the drop inlet on the street. So the idea is that we're splitting the flow, and we're trying to capture the dirty water and hold it and keep it there. So for example, if there's a drain at the bottom of this bioretention system in the landscape area, we wouldn't be holding the water. We'd be just passing it through. And this is very common. In fact, I work in Pennsylvania, and this is out of our manual in Pennsylvania. And you can see on one side, the left, the water is flowing in. And on the other side, the right, there's a raised drop inlet, a domed riser for overflow. Even this causes a problem because the pollutants that come in aren't going to immediately soak down into the soil. And if we get enough rain, they're going to be suspended on the surface in the water. And as water continues to come in, it's going to push the water that is in there first, the first flush, the most polluted water, to the outlet, to the overflow. So in this case, the polluted water comes in, it's held there until more water comes in after it, and that water then pushes the polluted water back out of the system into the drain. It would make much more sense to have the overflow located up on the street, or at least on the bank where the water's coming in, so that as the lot of time to talk about today, but it's an area that we really, really need to address and work on. The next area that I want to talk about is where do we put mulch? So mulch is always a problem with bioretention systems because the mulch is normally sent downstream. And the other thing I find really annoying is that people come back and remulch the system over and over again and continue to send the mulch downstream or clog the outlets. So we're suggesting there are many different alternatives for mulch, one of which, and only one, would be a river rock. Remember, the intent of the mulch is to hold moisture in the ground. The intent of the river rock is the same. It also reduces the flow rate. It also serves as a weed barrier. Now, I'm not saying that river rock works for everything, but I'm saying that it is an option that we can consider. So please don't put mulch in the flow path because all you're really doing is sending it downstream. Another issue to consider, different cities are coming up with typical details, which frankly are excellent. These are from Philadelphia Green Streets fandom. And I love these when they came out, and I still do. But one of the concerns that started to happen is that developers were given these choices, and the designers were not really pushing the envelope and trying to come up with new ways to do this sort of thing. So that became a bit of a problem. And because they weren't coming up with new ways to do things, it inhibited the creativity of the designers. So I think these are great, but we still need to find ways to push the envelope and try different things if we wish to. So again, municipalities have always had their regulations and their typical details, and I believe that we simply need to adopt them when they're appropriate, and we need to also challenge them with new designs that, for all we know, may become a typical detail in a few years. One area that does concern us, though, is maintenance. And the reason it concerns us is that when I work with municipalities, one of their biggest fears, in fact, I'll tell you their biggest fear, is maintenance, because they do not know how much it's going to cost, or how long, or how they're supposed to take care of that. So one of the things we have to do is, first off, we need to design systems so that the maintenance is more knowable and perhaps even easier. So, for example, there's no reason that we had to plant 20 varieties in a bioretention system when 2 or 3 would do, which simply makes maintenance much easier to folks that have to go and weed them out. Likewise, adding mulch to the point that it blocks the inlet is something we need to be aware of. But most of all, we need to actually plan for maintenance. We need to design maintenance plans and include them with the submittals that we make. So this is one we're still working on. We expect to find more information, but it's a difficult area and it's a scary area for the municipalities. So one more thing that I just want to share before I move to the next subject. This is about the idea of what people think of green infrastructure. And we did a study about 2 years ago, and these are the views that people had in their interviews with us. It's a necessary evil. It's defensive kingdoms. It's economically unfeasible and unfunded mandate. It's curtailing development, violating property rights. It's a means of redistributing wealth, which I never quite understood, but I'm sure I can go back and get an explanation. It's an attractive nuisance. It's a means of conservation. It's a compensation for past sins, or it's a house of cards. Now, what I haven't told you about these quotes is that they were from municipal officials. These were the mayors, the supervisors, and the town staff. So these are the opinions, not all of them, obviously, but some people have these opinions, and I'm not saying that their opinions are wrong. In fact, I think their opinions are right. And we as designers need to be able to address these opinions so that we can help get some of these projects into the ground and hopefully have them maintained and taken care of over the years. So we are about quarter after, and I can keep going with this for a little while. I don't know how many questions we have. So I'm going to run for a little while longer and give you some of my favorite yes buts. So here they are. When we travel around, we get folks that always tell us the reasons that they cannot do this. You know, yes, but that's in Portland, we can't do it here. Yes, but how do we know it works? Yes, but it's too expensive. Yes, but it freezes here. And of course, my favorite yes, but maintenance is an issue. So Portland, the place where young people go to retire, I've been told. You know, the idea that Portland is the only place that it can be done or should be done, I think we should challenge. Because the sewage discharge just here where I am in Pennsylvania, in the Willamette River, is the combined sewer overflow is a huge issue. And in fact, across the country, there are over 700 cities that have combined sewer overflow problems. And it's going to get much worse over time. And green infrastructure is one of the ways that we can address this because we can capture the first flush. So the need is everywhere. And although the designs may have started in Portland, there's nothing wrong with doing designs around the rest of the country that will also do the same thing. Yes, but how do we know it will work? We know it will work because we've done studies. Not myself personally, but there have been studies done over and over about how effective this is for maintaining the natural stormwater system and preventing the pollution of being released. It's also incredibly effective for combined sewer overflows, especially if it is distributed around the entire community. And we're not there yet. We will get there in time. Yes, but it's too expensive. One of the most common ones we hear. And yet, there have been studies that have shown that it's actually less expensive than gray infrastructure and that it raises the property values so that the payback for the folks that are putting it in may not be immediate, but it is a payback for the community. So yes, it does cost a bit to put in. I would question on the yes, but it's too expensive is the maintenance. On the flip side, I think it's important to recognize that all stormwater systems require maintenance, whether it is a pipe or a bioretention system. They all require maintenance. And I would also argue that if you could contain the silt and trash in a bioretention system, it's much easier if a system is properly designed to clean it out of a surface system than it is to clean it out of pipes, because the cost of getting it out of pipes is 10 times the cost of getting it out of the surface system. This has been one of my favorites for years. Yes, but it freezes here, so we can't do that. The natural environment does freeze, and water continues to flow, and sometimes it becomes ice. And we actually think that this is a design opportunity. It's one thing to see a sluice that has no water in it, dry, but you know it's going to carry water. It's another thing to see it when it's raining. But there's a great opportunity of when it's frozen, if we will actually design systems for this sort of aesthetic. And then maintenance will be an issue. Now, we've actually talked about this already. You know, we know that Joe is upset, and so how are we going to address some of these things? Well, to begin with, we need to make it robust and neat. We need to make it clear and clean so that people can understand it. And we need to invest in training the folks who are designing and putting it in so that we get systems that are easily maintainable. We're doing a study right now where we're actually not talking to the designers at all. We're talking to the folks who do the maintenance to find out how they would love to designers to change their designs to make maintenance easier. And with that, I'm going to pause because we are at 21 after on my clock, and I'm hoping we may have some questions.
Thank you, Stuart. Yes, we do have a few questions. The first question is, if the goal is infiltration, what is recommended in terms of soil and gravel layers?
Okay, so if the goal is infiltration, first off, you have to work with the soil that you have. So if you're in a heavy clay soil, it infiltrated very little in the first place, and you want to design a system that also infiltrates very little after development. What you do want to do, however, is spread the water out under these systems as shallow and as wide as you can, because the natural rain on the landscape is spread out across the entire landscape. The difficulty is when we concentrate the water in one spot and then expect it to infiltrate. So parking lots are a wonderful place to infiltrate if you can get the water under the parking lot, and obviously porous pavement is one option, but you can simply have drain inlets that lead to a gravel fill under the parking lot, but you have to be able to have an outlet that will control how much water is down there. What you don't want to do is try to force additional water into the ground beyond its capacity, because two things that will happen. In my part of the country, you'll create sinkholes, and in other parts of the country, it will simply clog the soil layers and it won't go in. So again, the soil that you have is what you have to work with. The part you're designing is just the gravel fill to hold the water above it. And you may also want to design a loamy soil above that to filter the pollutants out of the water, especially the hydrocarbons. We don't have a good way for filtering out salts and phosphates yet, but hopefully we'll find some.
Thank you. In terms of your response being you want to keep it wide and shallow, this question is about suggestions for resources, websites, or perhaps your book that would address artful rainwater solutions that have created large athletic fields as part of a controlled flood management strategy.
Okay. Actually, there are many resources available for that. If you want, you can go to our website and it will link you to some of them. But what we have found is that for athletic fields, most park departments have enough sense to put their parks in floodplains, because, you know, if your tennis court floods, that's not a tragedy compared to, you know, if your housing facility floods. And yes, there are many examples where you can infiltrate with an athletic field. One of the things that we discovered that it's a good idea to put under drains under the athletic field, so that you don't want that field to be soggy for 2 days. You really want to make people mad, flood their soccer fields on a Friday. It doesn't go well. You want to be able to drain by soccer time on Saturday.
Okay. This next one deals with the current weather patterns and increasing numbers of hurricanes and large rain events. Have the negative opinions diminished at all as all of these extreme weather events have increased?
It's made no difference whatsoever. Rainwater design specifically deals with small amounts of water, and it deals with polluted water. It does not reduce flooding, although it will reduce the frequency of flooding. So the small floods where you have to drive through it and walk through it, the nuisance flooding, it will reduce that. But obviously it's not going to do anything for the sort of rainfall that you get from hurricanes. It does, however, do something for the environment, in that most of the water that soaks into the environment comes from the small storms, and by replicating that system, you can put more water back into the environment when it does rain. But this is not a flood control measure.
Okay. This one is a residential scale question. Are there resources that you can recommend for aesthetic downspouts and other residential scale rain solutions?
I've seen a few for downspouts. Most of what I have seen are very artful rain chains. For the downspout itself, I've seen them that are spiraled. There's one of my favorites in Vine Street that we call a fuzzy mount downspout because it actually creates Ys on the way down, and there are air plants planted in the downspout. It doesn't do a great deal for stormwater, but it is a great fun aesthetic. It doesn't reduce pollution or anything. So no, other than that, I haven't seen a great deal when it comes to downspouts.
Okay. This last question that we have time for is about the unhappy property owner that you mentioned when you were talking about that rain garden project. And the question is, was there a solution for displeasure with the rain garden aesthetics?
The answer is yes, there was a solution. First solution, which is not very effective, was educate the homeowner. The second solution was simplify the design. Now, I'm not saying we're going to take out the CEOs and put in azaleas, but by simplifying the design and making sure that it was set up in a way that it appeared to be cared for. So a simple little idea is have a catch basin at the beginning that catches the trash and such and gets it down to where the homeowner cannot see it. And then only have 2 or 3 plants that have the most ornamental value to them as well as the pollution absorption value. So there are solutions that are available, and the retrofits are where we're finding it being done. But I do have our website up, and if you see the address on the website on side going vertical, it's Artful Rainwater Design.psu.edu. My email is spe10@psu.edu.
And thank you, Stuart. That was very, very helpful, and certainly has given us a lot to think about in terms of combining the engineering and the aesthetics